The topic of this webinar is the cloud comms evolution, why successful digital transformation requires an unbundled approach. My name is Mehmet Hussein. I'm the technical design authority here at Voxbone. I've been in the industry for approximately 10 years, and I hope to be bringing some of what I've experienced to this webinar and share some knowledge. So, without further ado, the evolution of IT has spanned probably 20, 30 years now, and it started with end-to-end infrastructure providers like IBM providing bespoke machines to solve a specific problem that were usually very high cost and only really applicable for quite niche circumstances. With the advent of the Internet, World Wide Web, we saw these being distributed and replaced by otherwise virtualized services replicating the same equipment. In the modern age now, we are seeing that IT services are being broken down into microservices. People are unbundling their IT infrastructure into separate consumable modules. This is playing a massive role in the digital transformation of many organizations because it is affording them a greater level of flexibility as they transform their IT stack. So as I've already indicated, companies are moving to the cloud through their digital transformation strategy. They're moving all aspects of their business to the cloud, the data, the platforms they use, and in some cases, the communications. Today, in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the communication side of things and how that has been impacted by digital transformation and moves to the cloud. So a short recap of comms, basically. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell patented the first recognizable telephone. He didn't necessarily invent it, but he was the first person to patent it. In 1960, the telephony world saw the advent of a switchboard PBX, which it handles calls much in the same way that modern Logix seems to handle them. In 1995, after the World Wide Web happened, IP telephony was invented. This is where VoIP came from. This is when VoIP was invented. In 2005, Voxbone was founded with the goal of simplifying the world of international communications. In 2006, VMware supercharged the virtualization capability of everything, and they allowed otherwise siloed boxes to be virtualized on almost universal equipment. This is where we started seeing the first virtualized PBXs. In 2012, we saw the rise of software as a service. You can now consume most things that you would consume within a business on an as a service basis. This is where we see things like UCaaS and CCaaS come to play in the communications industry. In 2017, the as-a-service industry started breaking down the communication stack, and we saw the rise of CPaaS, or things like Twilio and Plivo, where they started breaking down the different elements of the communication stack. And today, we have an enormous ecosystem of different modules that can be bolted together in an almost unlimited configuration. This is especially prevalent in the current climate that we're living through, where business continuity has been tested in full for probably the first time in a long time, for most people anyway, in terms of an absolute shift in way of working. And we're going to talk more about it in the webinar as we go on. So the traditional model by which we consume communications is a bundled product at the moment anyway. You get everything from one single supplier. So we're talking, there are famous name brands where you go and you buy all of your communications from one place. In one go, you pay one bill. You have little flexibility to do with what you can and can't do. You get no choice over upgrade paths or anything like that. You are given what you get, what you're given, but it is generally quite reliable, well put together, well tested, and it has proven successful in the market. On the flip side, you are contracted for services that you don't necessarily need. So you might be taking a whole suite of communications applications just because the provider that is providing it can provide the coverage where you need it. So you end up taking a whole load of features just to get the coverage that you need, or vice versa. You don't have true flexibility to pick and choose down to a very granular level and optimize efficiently your communications stack. You've got no direct access to phone numbers or the network layer, which means that you are paying a markup for these service providers to effectively manage these layers on your behalf. This is what will probably be the undoing of this kind of model. And by the way, there will be a question section at the end. Feel free to put the questions in the Q&A section now, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So the trend that I'm going to be talking about is what we are calling modularization, where you take the traditional bundled approach that you can buy now for cloud-based communications, and you break it out into separate layers. The first layer being the network layer. This is where Voxbone lives. We operate the phone numbers and the connections into various countries, and we facilitate that transit and comply with all the regulations and help our customers do that. The layer above that, or the layer below that, whichever way you want to go, is the logic layer. This is where the thing that defines what your communications use case lives is. I'm reticent to call it a PBX because more often than not nowadays, a PBX doesn't actually exist. It can just be a node application, or a suite of APIs, or a custom piece of programming interfaces using a standard into a SIP network. This is where you define what it is that your business requires, or what it is that you are going to bring to the market. And the third and final layer is the application or interface layer. This is where the end customer interacts with whatever it is that you've built in the logic layer that interfaces with the network layer, which gives you access to international telephony. We are seeing this trend on the increase, and we'll go through some of the benefits in the next couple of slides. So, network reliability. This is a big one, right? Because you've got in each layer of the stack that I've previously mentioned, you can cross-purchase and build in redundancies. So you don't have to necessarily contract with one carrier. Most people will be familiar with the fact of carrier redundancy and things like that. But you can also implement application redundancy and programming redundancy. So in the logic layer, you could subscribe to multiple application platforms that will only charge you on a usage basis. And should one platform go down, your logic could fail over to the alternative platform. This way, you've got redundancy at every layer. That brings you a much higher level of network reliability, which would have proven dividend in the climate that we're currently in. For example, Voxbone were able to transition from being office-based to home-based well ahead of the general international trend within 6 hours. Flexibility, because you've got direct access to the suppliers at each level of this stack, you've got much greater levels of flexibility. If your business needs to pivot and change what it's doing, its communications requirements might change. If you are running a campaign and you've never really run a campaign on a certain size or targeting a certain audience, you might require some temporary flexibility at some such other layer of your stack. It might be flexibility in capacity in a certain country that is better negotiated with a carrier, for example. Or it might be additional user seats sitting in another country, or in doing another thing or a different application. These are best negotiated with the specialists in the layer that you are consuming in. Operational efficiency. This is a biggie, right? It means that you're not paying for the services to be marked up and sold on, Imagine a scenario whereby you have a network provider like Voxbone selling to a large international carrier. They are in turn selling to a service provider. That service provider is in turn building a platform. That service provider's platform is resold to a managed service provider, who then goes on to resell that as part of a suite of products to the end consumer. You've got 4 or 5 markups already on the carrier grade services, which you can actually consume directly yourself if you want to. Now, a few of the comms platforms that are setting the trend in this respect, in terms of proving that this move to the modularized approach is happening. We can go over a few of them. So we've got Voxbone here, 3CX, Twilio, Plivo, Microsoft Teams, and Genesis Pure Cloud. All of these application platforms are pushing for the industry to move towards a modularized approach. They are proving that the model is working. So we've some use cases for direct end customers. We've got on the Voxbone network, at least, we've got prominent PCI payment providing platforms using this approach to consume our services to offer their capability out to the wider world. We've got companies like Uber, who were initially contracted with a service provider for all of their communications requirements, who have evolved with Voxbone to now consume in a modularized approach. And this is a good example of a direct enterprise doing this. Now, there are a few barriers to entry for this, and they are normally centered around complexity. I'm going to skip back a few slides because it helps for the visualization. If you were to consume in this approach, you would need to have a higher level of knowledge about how each one of these layers goes together, how the interactions work, and this has commonly been the barrier to entry for this model. What Voxbone is doing and what other providers in the wider communications space are doing is removing these barriers to entry by reducing the complexity at each layer. So we employ SIP standards. We use standard interface APIs to speak to whatever needs to speak to Voxbone. And we would encourage any other operator at any layer in the stack to use open standards so that we as a community of communication specialists can all communicate openly and allow enterprises and service providers to truly build the best application, widget, service, platform that they can to solve the problem that they're aiming at solving. Because if you were to look at inside the network layer, what we are really doing is transiting minutes across the world. And I would regard that as a utility type service. It's like water or gas or electricity. What you then do with the water or gas or electricity defines the requirements that you have for the water or gas electricity. And it's the same for communications. What you are going to do in the logic layer defines what you need in the network layer. So it shouldn't be the case that you go to consume an application, regardless of what you're going to do with it, you are forced to consume network layer and logic layer services completely not dependent on how you are going to use them, just defined by the negotiation by the service provider. So one, as I mentioned, complexity is the major barrier here, and this is what we are solving. So at Voxbone, at least, we have a very intuitive user portal to allow people to manage their services in real time. We have open APIs to allow people to manage and procure services in real time. These also enable service providers to incorporate Voxbone in a bring your own carrier type approach to directly pull through the configuration complexities and simplify them in a portal manner to their end customers. This model can be used to enable service providers to expand globally quickly. So when expanding globally, you will often have to face the regulatory requirements in all the countries that you're going to expand into. Now, this would normally involve some form of registration with the regulator in that country and such and such, which would require legal resources in that country, in that language, which are onerous and are normally another barrier for service providers to offer their services in those countries. If you are able to just build in the logic layer the thing that solves the problem that you are aiming to solve, and just say to the customer, you can get your utility service of your minutes and lines from Voxbone, who are already regulated operators in these markets, or any other carrier, and allow them to just communicate seamlessly. So you might build an integration as a service provider into your logic layer platform with Voxbone, with another carrier, and allow customers to come into your ecosystem and say, hey, I've chosen Voxbone as my SIP trunking provider in a drop-down list, and everything is pre-configured for me based on APIs and integrations that you've already done. This would allow you to offload the regulatory requirements to Voxbone. So Voxbone would have a direct relationship between themselves and the customer, satisfying the regulatory requirements in said country. And you as the service provider would have a relationship with the customer to provide the application and the logic and the service that they require. The customer has the power and the flexibility to switch out either one of those should their service not be up to what they are expecting. And this is the power of the modularization trend, and this is why we are seeing all of these big name brands who some of which started in the supplying everything to everyone phase. We're seeing them shift towards the modularization trends. And this is the point of the message that I'm driving at today. So now I will open the floor to questions, and hopefully we can have some thought-provoking questions and spark up a bit of a debate, because we have got a bit of time left. So let's have a look. So we've had a question come through asking what are the cost implications of such an approach. So it actually allows you a greater level of cost flexibility, because you're not being forced to buy the services which have been pre-marked up by your service provider. You can negotiate directly with the source and the provider of these services. So for example, you could come directly to Voxbone and you could negotiate on in-country specific rates and exclude countries that you don't necessarily need. You could go to your application provider and you can negotiate specifically for the modules that you require. It allows you a greater level of flexibility, especially in managing the cost. Is cloud comms widely integratable with common IT systems? Yes, that is exactly what we're driving at here. Common and wider IT systems are often API driven. The communication space wasn't necessarily API enabled. People like Plivo and Twilio and Voxbone have all worked to add APIs to the communications space, and these APIs are enabling communications type applications to interface seamlessly with the wider IT ecosystem. If you imagine you had a joiner and leaver process within a large enterprise, that is a complex IT ecosystem of changes that are all linked together. You could easily plug the provision of communication services into that workflow. So when you have a new joiner, all their accounts, their phone numbers, their applications are all set up in the countries that they require them, and then when they leave, messages are sent via API to all the different application layers and the network layer to cease all of those services. So they are absolutely integratable. What have you seen has been the biggest impact on cloud comms on Voxbone since the lockdown? So what we saw since lockdown was a massive spike in traffic. We nearly sold out of everything everywhere in the first few weeks of all this happening. Like many organizations, we underwent a monumental shift in the way that we were working. It hasn't necessarily been bad for us, but it's allowed us to see where the flaws are in the communications industry. There were many organizations that failed to pivot quickly and were forced into cloud-based platforms that were not necessarily tailored to their needs. We're now in the period sort of after the storm, where enterprises can look to optimize the purchases that they were otherwise forced to make. And this is what I would implore you to do. Have a look at your approach and see if it can be modularized, because this is often the most efficient way to build your communications stack. Are there any additional security considerations one needs to consider with such an approach? That's a fantastic question, right? Especially with all of the prominent news about encryption and certain communication providers out there. This is an important question. Absolutely, there are security considerations. Now, there are well-known and tested security mechanisms that can be used around API calls. So I think that is satisfied because it's not a communications industry specific problem. But when you look at the communications industry specifically, you have standards like SIP. SIP has built-in capability for media and signaling to be encrypted. This can be part of an end-to-end encryption strategy. The problem in the communications industry, and this is not unique to the modularized or the bundled approach, is that the PSTN network, or the plain old cables in the ground, there's no way to encrypt the traffic that is on those. So as part of the world moving towards SIP, this will get better and better and easier. But in terms of securing the modularized approach, yes, it can absolutely be secured, and to be as secure as any other approach. Arguably, you would have more control over the security at each layer and have more visibility over the failures of security between layers. For a small organization, is the bundled approach less hassle, or does it make a difference? So if you're a small organization, you might be thinking, okay, this is going to eat up a lot of manpower to manage all of these different vendor contracts. And on some level, you might be right. But actually what we're seeing is the ability to contract with truly cloud-based suppliers means that you don't really have to deal with them very often unless something goes wrong. If you are choosing the right provider at each layer in terms of making sure that they are resilient, redundant, and have a highly available network of whatever it is that they are providing, you will be very unlikely to have to get in contact with them, and make sure that their support flows are all automated, have all automated ticketing systems. You can even now get integrated support desks into your CRM. So people like Zendesk are allowing inter-organization federation between different Zendesk instances. This is all possible. There are tools available to help smaller organizations manage the vendor complexity there. There's also the aspect of the actual complexity of programming. You might think that you need additional headcount and additional capability to program for these use cases. That's not necessarily the case. A lot of the programming that is required now is all GUI based. It's drag and drop. There's very little that you have to do in the way of traditional command line type programming anymore. For example, integrations with Voxbone are all well documented and followable in a step-by-step process, none of which should take more than 5 or 10 minutes for anybody who's competent in IT to action. So there might be a marginal amount of increased hassle in the beginning, but that will be far outstripped by the operational efficiency and flexibility that you will gain in the long term. So we've been asked who do we work with in terms of which platforms are we compatible with. In answer to that, any platform that uses open SIP standards can work with Voxbone. So whether you've built your integrations inside Twilio uses SIP standards, you can use Twilio with Voxbone. Whether you've built your own bespoke application that has a WebRTC front end and you need a SIP trunking provider to connect into it, you can come and work with Voxbone. So long as you are using open SIP standards, you can work with Voxbone. This is also true for legacy telephony providers. People like Mitel and Avaya and Cisco. All of these platforms, albeit long-standing, all have a SIP core, so they can all work directly with Voxbone. What kind of organizations have seen the biggest efficiency gains and cost savings? So the larger and more complex your communications requirements are, the more efficiency gains and cost savings you will realize, because you will be able to optimize each stage of the stack to your specific requirements. So you will be able to contract with a carrier for service in only the countries that you require it in, and have a greater level of visibility and probably a higher level of capability in those countries, affording you the ability to get better value from the services that you offer. For example, if you were an outbound contact center, you might be limited to using international termination routes if you bought a bundled product. If you took a modularized approach, you would be able to contract directly with somebody like Voxbone and procure national termination routes for an in-country service. that would vastly increase your answer rate, because all of a sudden you're able to present a localized CLI. Now, if you look at the logic layer, you are able to optimize for the business that you are running, separate from what it is that you can consume on the carrier side. So you've already selected your carrier that best fits your needs, best fits your requirements. You are now free to choose any logic layer provider that fits your practical requirements in the countries that you are operating in. So you might require the best contact center, or you might require the best inbound conferencing platform. You are free to choose those depending on what your use case is. So the larger you are, and the more complex your use case is, the more cost savings you can realize. Now, you're not limited to one in each layer either. So you can have multiple carriers. Those could be servicing multiple purposes. You can have multiple stacked logic layer applications, much like Uber have done. So Uber have got multiple applications in the logic layer governing how they connect to Voxbone in the carrier layer, and they have a few carriers sitting in the background servicing all of these different logic layer applications. They've been able to totally optimize the communication strategy, and they have a very large and very complex enterprise-grade communications ecosystem. These are where the really very serious efficiency gains can be realized. You can contact us at any of these social media channels here. So we're on LinkedIn, we've got our own blog. You can find us on Facebook or at Voxbone on Twitter. Equally, you can email us at hello@voxbone.com or contact us on our contact us page at voxbone.com. Feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm definitely there. You can see my face plastered all over the adverts for this webinar. Thank you all for joining in and listening to me rattle on about this, but I hope you found it insightful. Please feel free to reach out on any of these channels below. I'd be happy to hear from you and happy